You saw in the previous section that when you write LINQ to SQL queries, you're querying against the entity classes. Well, you also use the entity classes when you're modifying data. So for example, to add a customer, you'd create an instance of the customer class, populate it with the correct data, and then add that to the customer's collection of the data context. To update a customer, you'd create an instance of the customer class, typically from a query, so that instance represents a particular customer, and then you modify the properties of that class. And to delete a customer, you remove the appropriate instance of the customer class from the customer's collection in the data context. So what's this look like in code? Well, to add a customer, we would do this. We'll call the insert_onSubmit method of the customer's collection belonging to the data context and add a new customer. So new customer would be an instance of the customer class. To modify a customer, it's just a simple setting of properties. We'll set the city property of the customer class to Eden Prairie. To delete a customer, we'll call the delete_onSubmit method of the customer's collection, and we'll delete a specific customer. And all three of these occur in memory, and if we want to save the changes back to the database, we call the submitChanges method of the data context. So let's go see a demo of modifying data in code. So I have the LINQ to SQL demo sample application running. Let's take a look at modifying data. So I'll press I. Our first example of modifying data is going to look like this. So here's what I want to do. The first thing I want to do is get a list of beverages and display the current prices, because after that we're going to change prices. So I'll first do a query, and I'll call it beverages before. Bring me back all of the products in the beverages category, and then for each one, display the name and the price. So let's run down to here. And so here are the current prices for all of the beverages. Okay, next, I'm going to loop through that same list of beverages, and I'm going to change the price. I'm going to drop the prices of beverages by 10%. So to change this data, all I do is change the correct property. So for the first product, which is chai, the price is currently 18, so I'm going to drop that by 10%, and then I'll do that for each of the products in the beverages category. So at the moment, this is all occurring in memory. I haven't sent the changes back. I do that by calling submitChanges on the data context. Now, as I've been changing these properties in these classes, the data context has been tracking the changes. So when I submit changes, LINQ to SQL will prepare the necessary SQL statement to do all those updates. We'll send that. Let's take a look in the SQL Server profiler and see what we just sent up. Well, we have a number of update statements. There should be one for each product. So for chai, here's the update statement. Update in product, set the price equal to this new price, where the product ID is equal to 1, and all of the other information. So we have an update statement for each of the products, and there were this many of them. We'll have that many SQL statements. Then what we're going to do is requery the database and bring back that same list of beverages and display the new prices. And we can see that we've now dropped the prices by 10%. In our next example, we're going to add a customer. So the first thing I want to do is get a list of customers in Washington. So the query is called WA customers before. So bring back customers where the region is Washington and show me company name, city, and region. So let's run the cursor down to here, and we can see that there are 3 customers in Washington. Now let's add a customer. So I'm going to create a new instance of the customer class. I'll call it new customer, and I'm going to, in the constructor, pass in the data. Construct a class and set the various properties at the same time. So now, new customer is an instance of the customer class, and it has all of the information set. So now I want to add the customer. So I'm going to call insertOnSubmit, which is a method of the customers. So nwindata.context.customers, that represents the collection of customers, and I'm going to insert on submit the new customer. And again, what this does is it adds the new customer to the in-memory collection of customers. Now we want to insert that customer for real. We submit our changes, and that's going to send to the SQL Server an insert statement. So insert into customers all of the information that we specified. Then we're going to rerun this query on the customers in Washington and display that right now there are 4 customers in Washington, including the one we just added. And of course, we could always go into the Server Explorer, connect to the database. I often do this just to prove conclusively that it was added and show the table data. So now I'm talking directly to the SQL Server, and here's the customer. Okay, in our third example, we're going to make a change to that customer. So I'm going to retrieve that customer from the database. Customer before is the query, nwindDataContext.customers.single, where the customer ID equals big. So now customer before represents that customer we just added. So there you can see the information. So now we're going to display the current contact name and title. So it's currently Robert Greene, President, and now we're going to make a change. We're going to change the contact name and the contact title, and all we need to do is give them new values. Ken gets an owner, and again, that's in memory. We want to send it back to the database. We submit changes. If we look in the SQL Server Profiler, there's an update statement. So set contact name equals to Ken gets, which is this parameter P11, and contact title equals P12, which is owner. Then we'll requery the database, bring back the information on that customer, and display that the current contact has now been changed. And then finally, to complete the cycle, let's delete the customer. So again, we'll bring down information on that customer in the variable customer big. So we'll call delete on submit, which is a method of customer. So just like insert on submit was a method of customers, so is delete on submit. So nwindDataContext.customers.deleteOnSubmit says remove the following from the collection of customers. And what we're removing is customer big. So we pass an instance of the customer class that represents that customer. We delete on submit, and then that actually occurs when we submit the changes. If we go into the SQL Server Profiler, as you would expect, delete statement. Delete from customers where customer ID is equal to big. Then we'll rerun the query on customers in Washington and show that that customer is now gone. So in code, very straightforward to add, modify, and delete into our database. That's working with a single table. Let's look at modifying related table. That's example J. So the first thing I want to do is bring down a customer and their orders. So I'm going to go into the customers table and bring back customer ID ALFKey. That's a single customer. And I'm going to bring down the company name and the order. So in this case, I can't use single because I'm bringing down the orders as well. So now customer orders before will have customer and order information in it. And now what I'm going to do is display the orders for this customer. So let's go down to here. Run to cursor. So this customer has placed 6 orders so far. Okay. Now what I want to do is create a new order for the customer. So I'm going to create a new instance of the order class, and I'm going to pass in the customer ID, the order date of today, required date of 7 days from today, and an employee ID of 4. I know that there's more information in the order, but this will suffice for our purposes here. And then what I'm going to do is add the order to customer_alfKey.orders. Customer alf key represents this customer. Orders represents the collection of orders for this customer, and I'm going to add the new order to that collection. Now I'm going to create new details for that order. So first detail is product 7 at a price of 25 and a quantity of 10. I'll add that to the order details collection that belongs to the new order. So I'll add another one for product 8, another one for product 12, and now I'm going to submit all of these changes. So if we go into the SQL Profiler, here's the insert statement into the orders table. That's the parent table, and then the 3 inserts into the order details table. And now this order's been added. Visual Studio automatically updates the order ID on the new order class for me, so I don't have to query for that. And then I'm going to rerun the query and bring back all of the orders for this customer and display them. So let's do that to here. And so we can see that indeed there's a new order added, 11078. Now I want the detail records for that. So I'm going to bring back from the order details table all details where the order ID is equal to that order we just added. And here are the details for that order. Well, so far we've been working with SQL statements. But of course, in a SQL Server database, sometimes you'll use SQL statements. You can also use stored procedures. So how do stored procedures work with LINQ to SQL? Well, you can drag stored procedures out of the Server Explorer onto the Object Relational Designer, and that will then add them as methods of the data context. This gives you the ability to call stored procedures directly. So for example here, if we have an add customer stored procedure, then we can just call that as a method of the data context and pass whatever information the add customer stored procedure expects. You can also configure the data context to use the stored procedures instead of generating SQL statements when you call submit changes. So for example, I could tell the data context, if I've added a customer, when I call submit changes, call that add customer stored procedure instead of generating SQL statements. Let's go see how that works. I've got the Object Model Demo project open, and we used this in a previous section to create an object model. So I want to go back to this because I want to show how you add stored procedures to the object model. So let's just review here. Let's zoom down to about 75. There we go. We have customer, order, order detail, product, and category. So it's the same model we've been using all along. And now what I want to do is add some stored procedures to the model. So if I come into the Server Explorer, I can expand the stored procedures. And these are the stored procedures in the database. Now some of these were created when I created the Northwind database, and others I've added. So specifically, I added add customer, add order detail, customers in region, delete customer, and update customer. I created those. So let's add some of these to the model. I'm going to add customer, customers in region, delete customer, and update customer. Before I do that, let's see what they actually do. So I'll right-click on add customer and open. And here's what this stored procedure does. It takes as an argument customer information, customer ID, company name, contact name, etc., and then inserts that into the customers table. So that's SQL statement to create a new customer. If we want to update a customer, let's take a look at that. This takes as an argument the customer ID, the company name, etc., and the original customer ID, because it is possible that you change the customer ID. And then the update statement is update customers, set that information where the customer ID is equal to the original customer ID. And then if I want to delete a customer, I'm going to pass the original customer ID and then delete from the customers table for that customer ID. The last one we're going to use is customers in region. That takes as an argument a region and then returns customers in that region. So I want to use all 4 of these in the model. So all I need to do is take each stored procedure and drag it into the right-hand pane of the Object Relational Designer, and these stored procedures are added. These now become methods in the data context with the same signature as the stored procedure. So let me save this. Now let's see that. Let's go back into the designer generated code for this, and let's find some of those stored procedures. I'm going to look up dbo.addCustomer. There we go. Okay, so now we can see that as part of the data context, I now have a method called addCustomer. And it uses a function attribute, the name argument of dbo.addCustomer, to identify that this method maps to the addCustomer stored procedure. And it takes as an argument a customer ID, which is an ncar5. That's as far as SQL Server is concerned. As far as we're concerned, it takes a customer ID as a string, and then all of the additional information. And then this executes a method call to the addCustomer stored procedure. So we have one for addCustomer, we have customers in region, delete customer, and update customer. These are all now methods of the data context. So let's go back to our LINQ to SQL demo example and see how to use these. We, of course, have these in the object model. And let's run this and see examples. So let's look at the first example of stored procedures. That's stored procedures 1. And so what I want to do is add a customer. So I'm going to create an instance of the Northwind data context, and I'm going to set the log property to console.out and write the SQL statement to the console window. And then I'm going to call the addCustomer method of the data context. And I'm going to pass a customer ID, a company name, a contact name, etc., all of the information to create a customer. And when I run that, here's the SQL statement that's sent. We're going to execute the addCustomer stored procedure and pass all of this information. We can confirm this by going into the SQL Server profiler, and of course we'll see the exact same thing. So now what I'm going to do is run this customers in region stored procedure and return all customers in Ohio. And we can see that AAAAA Consulting has been added to the customers table, and we now have our first customer in Ohio. All right, let's make some modifications to that. AAAAA Consulting is a little hard to say, so we're going to change the name to Pentubile Consulting, change a little bit of additional information as well, and we're going to do that by calling the update customer method. Pass the customer ID and the original customer ID and some additional information. We'll call that. If we go to the SQL Server profiler, we see that we've now called the update customer stored procedure. And we'll rerun the query by calling customers in region and display the customers in Ohio. We've now changed this information. And then finally, you can probably anticipate this, we're going to delete the customer by calling the delete customer method of the data context, passing in the customer ID, and that will have us call the delete customer stored procedure in the SQL Server database. Now when we run our query to see customers in Ohio, we don't have any anymore. So once I add those stored procedures to the object model, I can call them as methods on the data context. But there's another way to use them, and that is to configure the data context to use these stored procedures when I call submit changes. So what I want is when I add a customer, I want to use the add customer stored procedure. Similarly for update customer and delete customer. Well, to do that, I right-click on the customer class, and I select Configure Behavior. And this dialog lets me, for all of the classes in here, configure the insert, update, and delete behavior. And the default is use runtime, which says that LINQ to SQL will automatically generate insert, update, and delete statements. So we've seen that throughout. And we saw that in the previous demo. What I'm now going to do is tell the data context, when I insert a customer, use the add customer stored procedure. And here's how the method arguments map to class properties. So I'll click Apply. And now what I'll do is tell the data context, when I update a customer, you should use the update customer stored procedure, and the original customer ID is customer ID original. And now I'll apply that. And then finally, for delete, I'll tell the data context to use the delete customer stored procedure, and original customer ID is customer ID original. So now what I've done is told the data context use those stored procedures. I'll save this, let's run this, and let's see how that works. That's the last example here, stored procedures 2. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new customer by creating a new instance of the customer class. Then I'm going to call customers.insertOnSubmit, passing that new customer, and now I'm going to call submit changes. In the previous demo, we saw that LINQ to SQL would generate an insert statement. Here, we see that LINQ to SQL generates a call to the add customer stored procedure. And we've added this customer. Next up, we'll make a modification. First thing we need is an instance of the customer class that points to that customer. So we'll retrieve that. Customer AAAAA represents that customer. We're going to change company name, contact title, address, city, a bunch of the other information, and now we'll submit the changes. In the earlier demo, we saw that LINQ to SQL would send an update statement. Now it sends a call to the update customer stored procedure to make those changes. And then finally, we'll delete this. We'll get a reference to the customer. Then we're going to call customers.deleteOnSubmit, pass that reference. And now when we submit changes, instead of LINQ to SQL generating a delete statement, it generates a call to the delete customer stored procedure and deletes that customer. So by dragging and dropping the stored procedures into the object model, they become methods of the object model, and we can call them directly. We can also configure the data context to use those stored procedures when we call submit changes.